It is Tuesday, October the 9th, 2018. This is the Dissident Peasant Podcast. I am your host, Jeff in Georgia. On today's show, the vision of Helen Keller, radical communist and socialist. Part 2, her later life, what she got up to, why you should give a shit about it, perhaps today, in 2018. Before I get to all that, I just want to remind you that this show is brought to you by people like you at patreon.com/dissidentpeasant. I appreciate all the support there, big and small. It means so much to me. Thank you very much. Each word insightful yet simple, sophisticated but without taking the audience's prior knowledge for granted, accurate, entertaining. All this is hard to pull off, and I work at it. So if you appreciate that, maybe go to patreon.com/dissidentpeasant. There is a PayPal button at my website, which is headquarters, which is dissidentpeasant.com, always and forever. Thank you all very much. Last week I talked a great deal about Helen's early childhood and formal education. If you were excited to learn more about her socialism and eventual communism very quickly, I humbly beg your pardon. Before we move on to that stuff, though, there's just 2 more quick items about that education and childhood that I want to make sure everyone understands. The first is that the fastest and most common way that Helen communicated with people on the fly was with manual spelling. That is, words spelled into her hand by others who understood how to. She would never use the North American Sign Language or become a part of its deaf community. From her perspective, the goal was to emulate and live within the broader society of hearing and seeing peoples as much as she could. I am not here to adjudicate or even explore the mixed record of Helen in the modern deaf education community, but I want to let you know that they are not uniformly happy with her, and it stems in large part from Helen's method of education as a girl, her contact with Dr. Alexander Graham Bell, and her personal point of view. Helen would always view herself as a blind person who could not hear, as opposed to the other way around. And truthfully, blindness was a much more isolating condition among the working class laborers in the industrializing world of Helen Keller than deafness was, in terms of wider societal integration. But among that deaf community, her legacy is mostly one of opposition to their native language rights. The second thing I want to tell you about that education is to answer a question. A bachelor's degree from a College of Arts and Letters in 1904 means what exactly? What did she study? Well, beyond the stuff that we might call the core classes, like some math and some science and whatnot, Keller studied the written word. New stuff, old stuff, novels, stories, nonfiction, literature, not just in English. Keller would actually, over time, learn French, English, and German in Braille, and could also converse in these languages manually. This ability would indirectly help her socialism along, in a sense, not because of anything she learned at Harvard, but because she was able to take in foreign socialist periodicals from Germany, printed in Braille. This was all in addition to what her friends and comrades would tell or read to her themselves whenever they visited her. But back to the central question. When did Helen Keller become a socialist? And spoiler, later she'll be a straight-up communist. And how did that happen exactly? Well, she herself wrote about how and why, and even more so than I have other figures in this show, I will now quote Helen a fair amount in this episode from time to time. Helen Keller fought incredibly hard to communicate with the outside world and learn about it. And in gratitude, the output of that struggle has been largely unremembered, not just by the socialist or communist left, but really the entire world. I have read, and suppose myself, that she was beginning to lean red in the parlance of our times before she ever even entered college. But according to her own account, it all started when she read a book. Yes, those most pernicious and harmless-looking devices, always causing trouble and anguish in the hearts of all those who employ them. In this case, the culprit was H.G. Wells' New World for Old. At a bit over 300 pages and published in 1908, it's sort of weird, honestly, though not totally without merit. In it, Wells rejects what he calls the revolutionary socialism of Marx, excessively mechanical, deterministic, as well as the administrative socialism of the Fabians, don't worry about it, in favor of a more constructive socialism, a socialism of the spirit, whose quintessence is service and not pontification, more a religious philosophy than a political movement. Keller quite liked this book, which was quite influential in Britain, particularly among the socialists there, and this would inspire her to consume more literature on socialism from wherever and however she could. And as one of the most famous Americans in the world, whose writings and articles were always in great demand by newspapers, when she began to write about this socialism, things turned rapidly. As Helen put it, quote, "I like newspapermen. I have known many, and 2 or 3 editors have been among my most intimate friends. Moreover, the newspapers have been of great assistance in the work which we have been trying to do for the blind. It costs them nothing to give their aid to work for the blind and to other superficial charities, but socialism, that is a different matter. That goes to the root of all poverty and all charity. The money power behind the newspapers is against socialism, and the editors, obedient to the hand that feeds them, will go to any length to put down socialism and undermine the influence of socialists." End quote. When she started doing this kind of shit, any press outfit owned by the Rockefellers, for example, wouldn't print a word she said, until she made such a fuss for them that they finally had to relent. Other outfits began lying about her to varying degrees of bald-facedness, and claimed she was little better than a thrall to those who fed her information, a near puppet. One of these is the now long-gone newspaper known as the Brooklyn Eagle. Keller writes thusly, quote, "Some years ago I met a gentleman who was introduced to me as Mr. McKelway, editor of the Brooklyn Eagle. It was after a meeting that we had in New York in behalf of the blind. At that time the compliments he paid me were so generous that I blush to remember them. But now that I have come out for socialism, he reminds me and the public that I am blind and deaf and especially liable to error. I must have shrunk in intelligence during the years since I met him. Surely it is his turn to blush. Oh, ridiculous Brooklyn Eagle, what an ungallant bird it is. Socially blind and deaf, it defends an intolerable system. A system that is the cause of much of the physical blindness and deafness which we are trying to prevent. The Eagle is willing to help us prevent misery provided, always provided, that we do not attack the industrial tyranny which supports it and stops its ears and clouds its vision. The Eagle and I are at war. I hate the system which it represents, apologizes for, and upholds. When it fights back, let it fight fair. Let it attack my ideas and oppose the aims and arguments of socialism. It is not fair fighting or good argument to remind me and others that I cannot see or hear. I can read. I can read all the socialist books I have time for in English, German, and French. If the editor of the Brooklyn Eagle should read some, he might be a wiser man and make a better newspaper." End quote. In 1912, Helen Keller revealed that she had officially joined the Socialist Party of America, or SPA, after reading what she called all the classic socialist authors. Marx and Engels, and more, though she was inclined towards socialism much earlier than that. At the moment of her announcement, she was one of the most famous Americans in the world, as I mentioned before, but Keller could guard no barricades for the revolution. Hell, for the moment, she couldn't even vote, the franchise having not yet been extended universally to women in the United States. But the revolution would always have her voice in print and in speech for the rest of her life. The women's suffrage movement, of which Helen Keller was a part, is sometimes glossed over a bit in the early 20th century history of activism. Perhaps we as a society largely take it for granted that women voting is a normal, regular thing. Perhaps it's the persistence of a culture that has never truly appreciated the oppressive nature of patriarchy for women and girls. Whichever it is, or neither, or both, or more, Keller's reasons for supporting women's suffrage was one of both equality and socialism. Quote, "We shall not see the end of capitalism and the triumph of democracy until men and women work together in the solving of their political, social, and economic problems. I realize that the vote is only one of many weapons in our fight for the freedom of all, but every means is precious, and equipped with the vote, men and women together will hasten the day when the age-long dream of liberty, equality, and brotherhood shall be realized upon the earth." End quote. The party she had joined was the fusion of the Social Democratic Party of America and disaffected members of the Socialist Labor Party of America. This was the same party of the anti-war activist Eugene V. Debs, who ran for president the same year Keller announced, and for whom Keller campaigned for. This party, highly factionalized at this point and with a large base in German and other immigrant communities from the peoples of Europe, was still struggling to form strong ties to the broader labor movement. Keller was vehemently opposed to the Great War in Europe, or what we now call World War I, when it broke out in 1914. This war's effects are often given short shrift in broader histories too, that are so often focused on either the great men and women who wielded power, or the broader cultural and economic forces sweeping the peoples of the world along. Histories are often told as if either viewing a specimen close up with as much detail as can be mustered, or from as great a distance as possible, so as to encompass every conceivable force which may have acted upon the specimen's course. Rarely is the lens focused on medium resolution, if you will. World War I's bloodletting of humanity was so great that it single-handedly altered the course of human output in many different spheres. Music, for one, was changed forever, I learned once upon a time. Gone were the master romantics and impressionism, by and large anyway. This was replaced by men and women who had viewed the hell that is war from varying distances, and from this 1,000 bizarre blossoms bloomed: atonal, polytonal music, minimalism, all kinds of crazy stuff. Ditto for painting, architecture, literature, religion, philosophy, and yes, even stuff like international relations, the sciences, economics. The shockwave of the Great War reverberated throughout all these disciplines. Anyway, when Eugene V. Debs was arrested and his conviction eventually upheld for speaking out against the senseless bloodletting I just described and urging resistance to the war effort, Keller would write to him in 1919, quote, "We were driven into the war for liberty, democracy, and humanity. Behold what is happening all over the world today. Oh, where is the swift vengeance of Jehovah, that it does not fall upon the hosts of those who are marshaling machine guns against hunger-stricken people? It is the complacency of madness to call such acts preserving law and order. Law and order? What oceans of blood and tears are shed in their name? I have come to loathe traditions and institutions that take away the rights of the poor and protect the wicked against judgment. The wise fools who sit in the high places of justice fail to see that, In revolutionary times like the present, vital issues are settled not by statutes, decrees, and authorities, but in spite of them. Like the Girondins of France, they imagine that force can check the onrush of revolution. Thus they sow the wind, and unto them shall be the harvest of the whirlwind. You, dear comrade, I have long loved you, because you are an apostle of brotherhood and freedom. For years I have thought of you as a dauntless explorer going towards the dawn, and like a humble adventurer, I have followed in the trail of your footsteps. From time to time, the greetings that have come back to me from you have made me very happy. And now I reach out my hand and clasp yours through the prison bars. End quote. One other shockwave, world-sized, you are probably at least somewhat familiar with, also occurred during Keller's lifetime, deeply related to World War I, and one in which she was supremely interested. In 1912, she wrote How I Became a Socialist. In 1916, she wrote Why I Became an IWW. But when a pair of revolutions in 1917 dismantled Tsarist autocracy, banished serfdom, and declared a new republic, a Soviet republic, in an event what is today simply known as the Russian Revolution, Helen was stoked. Quote, in the East, a new star is risen. With pain and anguish, the old order has given birth to the new, and behold, in the East, a man-child is born. Onward, comrades, all together. Onward to the campfires of Russia. Onward to the coming dawn. During the resulting civil war in 1917 and 1918 in Russia, which you may have heard described as the Whites versus the Reds, or the Bolsheviks versus the Mensheviks, the United States government, under personal enemy to Helen Keller, President Woodrow Wilson, did much to aid the Whites. This faction, with a base in basically everyone from the liberal center to the reactionary right, but with a smattering of socialists opposed to Bolshevik-dominated state restructuring, Helen Keller called Woodrow Wilson the greatest individual disappointment the world has ever known. And he probably remains one of the most overrated presidents in United States history. Rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, and an intense desire by each to destroy the other, is sometimes imagined to have its genesis in the post-World War II rivalry between the two dominant coalition partners of the Allies, once victory over the Axis powers was achieved. But in reality, it begins right here, as soon as the Soviet Union itself does, in 1917. To quote one historian, Robert Maddox, quote, the immediate effect of the intervention was to prolong a bloody civil war, thereby costing thousands of additional lives and wreaking enormous destruction on an already battered society, and there were longer-range implications. Bolshevik leaders had clear proof that the Western powers meant to destroy the Soviet government, if given the chance. End quote. Out of this doesn't just spring civil rights repression and Red Scares in the United States, but begins a more or less unbroken aggressive posture on the part of the American Empire towards the Soviet Union, interrupted only by an alliance to defeat German and Japanese fascism temporarily, of course. It cannot be stressed. The siege mentality this introduced to the peoples of the Soviet Union at its very core, one that would wax and wane over the course of its history as a political body, but never wholly dissipate. This American intervention in 1917 involved at least 11,000 American troops who would fight in the Russian Civil War for the losing white side exclusively. And I tell you all of this because even though we've forgotten it today, Keller knew it just as well as I do. She wrote about all of this and particularly chided the Americans for trying to be sneaky about it and wage war undeclared. You've probably noticed that when I quote Helen, there's a strong tint of spirituality, perhaps even religiosity to it. Quote, I think that every honest belief should be treated with fairness, yet I cry out against people who uphold the empire of gold. I am aware of moods when the perfect state of peace, brotherhood, and universal love seems so far off that I turn to division, pugnacity, and the pageant of war. I am just like St. Paul when he says, I delight in the law of God after the inward man, but I see another law in my members, warring against the law of the mind. I am perfectly sure that love will bring everything right in the end, but I cannot help sympathizing with the oppressed, who feel driven to use force to gain the rights that belong to them. End quote. Or here maybe, quote, the Russian Revolution did not originate with Lenin. It had hovered for centuries in the dreams of Russian mystics and patriots, but when the body of Lenin was laid in simple state in the Kremlin, all Russia trembled and wept. The mouths of hungry enemies fed on new hopes, but the spirit of Lenin descended upon the weeping magnitude as with cloven tongues of fire. And they spoke one to another and were not afraid. Let us not follow him with cowering hearts, they said. Let us rather gird ourselves for the task he has left us. Where our dull eyes see only ruin, his clearer sight discovers the road by which we shall gain our liberty. Revolution he sees, yea, and even disintegration, which symbolizes disorder, is in truth the working of God's undeviating order. And the manner of our government shall be no less wonderful than the manner of our deliverance. If we are steadfast, the world will be quickened to courage by our deeds. End quote. So, Keller was no atheist, that's for sure. But she was also not really a Christian either. Except perhaps in the loosest possible sense. She did not accept the doctrine of the Trinity, nor the exclusivity of salvation to believers in the resurrection of that figure called Jesus Christ, which nearly all Christian denominations proclaim are vital. I stopped to explain this because you may read here or there that she wrote or transcended herself based on her Christian faith, which I do not think quite right. She was a member of what is broadly called simply the New Church today, or somewhat sillier, Swedenborgism, a group of Christian sects that grew out of the teachings of scientist and mystic Emanuel Swedenborg. And yes, he's from exactly the country you think he was. I'm going to be pretty broad here and try to be respectful, despite the fact that I am not an adherent of the New Church. The New Church is a sort of Unitarianism that proclaims Christ's second coming as to have already happened, and proclaims Christ as God in a single person to be worshipped, and that to truly do this, you must live according to God's commandments. Non-believers who have nonetheless strived to be good, because goodness is God itself, can achieve salvation under the New Church. It's not a matter of faith, in other words. Helen herself wrote all about her religious views in a book. I quote her now, quote, but in Swedenborg's teaching, it, divine providence that is shown to be the government of God's love and wisdom and the creation of uses. Since his life cannot be less in one being than another, or his love manifested less fully in one thing than another, his providence must needs be universal. He has provided religion of some kind everywhere, and it does not matter to what race or creed anyone belongs if he is faithful to his ideals of right living. Helen Keller was also a proponent of racial equality. She met a young W.E.B. Du Bois while he was in college at Harvard. Later sent his magazine $100 in the 1920s and a nice letter of support. Radical actions for a white woman from Alabama. Du Bois wrote of her, quote, courageously and frankly, she spoke on the iniquity and foolishness of the color line. It cost her something to speak. They wanted her to retract, but she sat serene in the consciousness of the truth she had uttered. And so it was proven, as I knew it would be, that this woman who sits in darkness has a spiritual insight clearer than that of many wide-eyed people who stare uncomprehendingly at this prejudiced world. End quote. In the 1920s, to pay the bills, she worked the vaudeville circuit, believe it or not. She also was a founding member of the American Civil Liberties Union, focused then on defending anti-war activists mostly. Helen also very nearly eloped with a dude 3 times in the 1930s named Peter Fagan. Helen, even as a girl, would ask men who came to the house if she was pretty or not, and she wanted the truth. When Anne Sullivan, her angel of light, fell ill, Peter was brought in to help assist Ellen as a secretary. They became lovers, secretly engaged, and planned to elope before interference from Anne and Helen's family thwarted their plans. I'm not sure exactly what happened, but I do know that it was seen as extremely scandalous for disabled women to take husbands at the time. And I tell you this because, well, you should know that Helen was not some sort of otherworldly creature who had all the time in the world to think and write. A marble statue whose light transcends something as humane as sexuality, but Helen was a real flesh and blood woman, and like many women then and now, she enjoyed sex and romance. Like I said, her and Peter would ultimately try and fail to elope 3 times in an era where eugenics was a popular ideology among the upper classes. Yes, believe it or not, despite the non-genetic cause of her condition, it was still feared that she might pass on some of her defects to children. Despite this disagreement, when Anne Sullivan died in 1936, Helen was there to hold her hand during her passing. Helen Keller was also extremely pro-birth control, and there is some question as to her degree of sympathy with eugenics herself. Certainly, she was a big supporter of family planning and a woman's right to choose whether or not to bear children. But it appears she was also not opposed to euthanasia or abortion in cases where the baby is not likely to experience the happiness, intelligence, or power necessary to give its life sanctity, as she put it. Though you often read this kind of thing from Catholic propaganda outlets in particular, and overblowing the flaws of radical leftists and pinning this particular bugaboo to them in American history is incredibly common, tagging folks as eugenicists, that is, who fought for the rights of people in the early 20th century. Helen Keller met every single United States president, from Grover Cleveland to John F. Kennedy, in person. In Kennedy's case, she urged him vigorously to support the civil rights movement of the time. She also obtained that most coveted and cred-signifying items that marked the revolutionary from the enthusiast or the poser, her very own FBI file. She traveled abroad both before and after World War II. In particular, she was the first American to receive an Akita from the Japanese government just before World War II. She visited dozens of countries. During World War II, she primarily toured military hospitals to meet disabled soldiers, many of whom were blind and deaf themselves. Post-war, she was one of our better and more popular goodwill ambassadors to post-war Asia and Europe. She, who fought for years to find her voice, developed both impeccable penmanship and literary craft. Keller remained a communist for the rest of her life. Though post-World War II, we're talking about somebody in their mid-60s now, and it appears she mostly went unharassed by the government. But not because she ever quieted down of her own volition, really. In 1955, in some of the hottest times of the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, Keller wrote a public letter to the leader of the American Communist Party, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. For some context, this is the same year the military alliance known as the Warsaw Pact was formed, the eastern response to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization formed by the United States and its allies. Flynn was then in jail for violating the Smith Act and allegedly advocating the overthrowing of the United States government. Quote, "Loving birthday greetings, dear Elizabeth Flynn. May the sense of serving mankind bring strength and peace into your brave heart." End quote. This shit would piss off her more conservative or orthodox liberal backers her entire life. And she never quit doing it. In 1960, she suffered a stroke and retired from public life more or less completely after 1961. In 1964, a high-riding LBJ, fresh off of vanquishing Barry Goldwater, tried to grab as much shine as he could from her reputation by awarding her the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor the United States of America can bestow. Whatever his reasons, it was a good choice, and she deserves it. She was the first woman Harvard ever honored with an honorary doctorate, if you care for such accolades. She passed away in her sleep on June 1st, 1968, just shy of her 88th birthday. She is buried at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., next to Woodrow Wilson. In fact, where they are, as historian James Lowen once put it, as close physically in death as they were distant ideologically in life. Keller's legacy, in some senses, has been largely forgotten. In others, it has been too amply celebrated, I'd say, in a process of heroification that leaves Helen an otherworldly thing, too good to be true, too wholesome and reflective, too perfect despite imperfection to take seriously. This is probably why Helen Keller jokes remain a thing, a reaction against the overly sweetened Keller. Helen's socialism and later communism, on the other hand, is almost entirely unexamined. Her arguments mostly completely unanswered by pretty much everyone. The conflicts between her flexible yet defined Unitarianism with the atheism of the Marxist-Leninist line, perhaps even her naivete about the dangerous products of Mao and Stalin, there are basically no reflections or explorations of any of this. Just messages about the power of education, perseverance, good old faith in God. Lame. Helen Keller was a famous person from the age of 8 till the end of her life. Near that end, she said, quote, "I believe that all through these dark and silent years, God has been using my life for a purpose I do not know." She added, quote, "But one day I shall understand, and then I will be satisfied." End quote. With respect to Helen Keller, I think we each make our own purpose in life, however determinist or Marxian my sympathies might be. For each of us, it is harder or easier to fall onto this side or that side of the moral question of the day due to the circumstances of familial connection, class, race, gender, even the age of the person or their geography. For Helen, that purpose, or purposes, really, is not to fiddle with repairs on a machine that grinds up people. It was to dismantle that machine and build a new one designed to fulfill human needs other than the needs from mindless accumulation and profit. And you know what? She busted her ass trying to figure out how to tell us what she thought of all that. Us ratchet mass of humanity. The least we can do is hear her out for a bit. Thank you for joining me today. Next time, I have no idea what I'm going to do. Something awesome, probably. Until that time, stay dissident, serfs.